I'm thrilled today's guest, Bret Stephens, is not only a opinion columnist for the New York Times, he's my favorite opinion columnist in the New York Times. Welcome to the show, sir.
Nice to see you, Donnie.
So much to talk about today. I first want to talk about a speech or a talk you gave at the Y, which you spoke about anti-Semitism, and you said, and I'm going to quote, such interesting things. You said, quote, "They do not hate us because of our faults and failures. They hate us because of our virtues and successes. Constantly seeking to prove ourselves worthy in order to win the world's love is a fool's errand." A very bold and new take on fighting anti-Semitism. Give me your thoughts on that.
Basically, I think that we as Jews individually and as a Jewish community have to cultivate our sense of identity, our pride, our knowledge about our traditions and our history, our determination to be ethically, intellectually, and in every other way excellent. But the Jewish community today spends hundreds of millions of dollars in what I think is a largely wasted effort in a so-called fight against anti-Semitism. You probably saw that ad during the Super Bowl. Millions of dollars spent on what to my mind was a useless ad, when we should be building Jewish day schools to make our kids more knowledgeable about, who and what they're about. Summer camps, trips to Israel, a real understanding of why this tradition of ours, which is 3,500 years old or more, has been so enduring, why it's such a precious inheritance, and why we should want to pass it on to our kids.
Yeah, it's very counterintuitive, but really smart. It was interesting. A lot of people came out against that ad. My feeling was, look, anything is good. I mean, it's still a arrow shot in the right direction. But you're right. Your whole attitude of like, we're not going to change the way people feel. Let's just build up our strength.
Anti-Semitism is really a problem for anti-Semites more than it is for us. I mean, I'm not blind. I understand the threats that the Jewish community faces. Bondi Beach, October 7th, around the world. But, when you think of what's happening in Iran today, and I'm sure we're going to get to that, why has the Iranian regime, why has it put itself in such a weak position? Why is the rial $1.5 million or so to the dollar? Why have they so enfeebled themselves, despite the fact that that Iran's culture, its traditions are old and proud and rich, and the country has some of the greatest energy resources in the world? Because the regime has essentially devoted its entire existence to try to destroy Israel rather than build up its own identity and its institutions. By the way, that's what happened to Nasser's Egypt in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Every country that has essentially gone to war against the Jews has wound up destroying itself. One of the reasons why I think the United States has flourished is that we have been welcoming and tolerant and accepting of so many minorities. And from the very beginning, from 1654, when the Dutch East India Company refused Peter Stuyvesant's request to kick out the Jews who had just landed there, this has been a place that has allowed excellence to flourish and has allowed small minorities who have their own traditions and their own ways to do well. And in some sense, Jews being that kind of long-standing minority in so many communities, we are the acid test of whether a country is going to succeed or fail. When England let the Jews back in the 1650s, that's when England started to take off as a great power in Europe. And one of the things that I worry about in terms of anti-Semitism today, and the fact that it's so widespread, not only on the anti-Zionist left, which uses anti-Zionism but essentially repeats the old tropes about the Jews, but on the increasingly anti-Semitic right, is that it's a sign, it's a symptom of a kind of a deeper cancer in our society, that we are now making the mistake that other countries made historically in turning on the Jewish population, and that it says something. It tells us that something is wrong with us. It is one of those symptoms that should help us diagnose what has gone wrong in the United States today.
Let's talk about the war. You recently wrote a column a few days ago that I couldn't agree with more. You basically said that Trump and Netanyahu are doing the world a favor, and you basically broke it down to kind of 4 points of view. Can you take my listeners through that?
Sure. Well, let's begin. Let me begin by just refuting, one common conception out there, which is that the Trump administration is starting another forever war. What the Trump administration with Netanyahu, what they're doing is they're trying to end a forever war that was launched against us in 1979 when Iran took our embassy staff hostage. And that war has never ceased, either against us or against the Israelis. So what the first thing to say is that this is not an effort to start a war. It's an effort to end a war by ending a regime that's been making war on us for generations now, for at least 2 generations. You know, there is a view that somehow we have been dragged into this war by the Israelis. That is not at all the case. We're going to war with the Israelis, and it's an amazing thing that we have a coalition partner that matches our strength rather than, being there in effect symbolically. Iran right now is the 3rd member of an axis of authoritarians that threaten us on multiple fronts. The Russians threaten us in Europe. The Chinese threaten us in East Asia. You remove Iran from that equation, and that means Iranian oil stops flowing to the Far East, to the Chinese, illicit Iranian oil. Iranian drones stop heading towards Ukraine. If you're someone who wants Middle Eastern peace, as I do, and I'm sure you do, there is no possibility whatsoever that a Palestinian state is going to come into existence if Israelis have a very good reason to believe that that Palestinian state is just going to be an extension of Iranian power, which is what Hamas was in Gaza. So if you want Middle Eastern peace, you should want this war against Iran to succeed. And finally, and this is not a small thing, this is a regime that just killed 32,000 of its people in 2 days. 2 days. Campuses are up in arms because over the space of 2.5 years, Israel killed a combination of civilians and Hamas militants, 70,000, so a little more than twice that number in 2.5 years. This is a regime that just committed the single biggest massacre in modern day history. And if you care at all about ending such an evil, you should at least be morally sympathetic with the aims of this war. And I'm just delighted that at least in its early hours, its early days, and we're just 5-6 days into this, it seems to be going extraordinarily well. So I think we should be wishing for the success of the operation, not looking for every single opportunity to insist that this is going to end in failure and that this is an illegal war that should never have been waged.
What does it say to you that Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, AOC, Gavin Newsom, all come out on the same side that this war was a mistake?
Well, I mean, I think it tells you something. Look, I don't want to cast aspersions on every critic of the war, right? And I think there's no doubt that the Trump administration could have done a hell of a lot of a better job explaining its aims to the American people. This is not some overnight operation to snatch a rogue dictator in Venezuela. This is a serious military operation. Our troops are at risk. We've lost, as we speak now, as far as I know, about 6 service members. So there's no doubt that someone like Hakeem Jeffries or Chuck Schumer could absolutely and fairly raise the point. Congress needed to be much better consulted than it was. The case needed to be made. But what you're seeing, at least in terms of like the talk show, or not talk show, but the kind of the podcast extremists, many of them on the right, but not a few of them also on the left, I think is a fairly ill-disguised form of anti-Semitism. I mean, you heard Tucker Carlson going off on this subject. A number of them have seized on a kind of a fumbled answer from Marco Rubio to suggest that somehow Israel dragged us into this war, as if Trump has not wanted to get rid of this regime probably since 1979. I basically feel sorry for those people. I feel sorry for Tucker. Father Coughlin is today remembered as one of the most heinous and despicable figures in American history. This was the Catholic priest who was a raging anti-Semite and isolationist on the eve of World War II. And that's essentially the reputation that Tucker is now creating for himself. I'm sure he's making a lot of money. I'm sure he's getting a lot of he's certainly getting a lot of attention for himself. But he's not only just discrediting himself as a serious commentator, but his children, his grandchildren, are going to have to live with the shame that their grandfather or father or grandfather came out as a kind of a increasingly flagrant anti-Semite. I can't think of any example in history when a screaming anti-Semite was well remembered by people in future generations.
That's such a great point. What's best case scenario with this war? Let's shoot for the stars. Give me the happiest ending here.
Well, I think there's a best case and a second best case. Let me take you over both of them. The best case scenario is that when Iran's apparatus of repression is systematically dismantled and destroyed, you will have a scenario in which different cities start to rebel, take over police stations, take over the headquarters of the IRGC, get aid from the regular Iranian army. Remember, Iran has two armies. It has the militant army, the IRGC, but then it has a kind of a normal army. Get assistance from the IRGC and start to take matters into their own hand and have something like what happened in Syria on the eve of the destruction of the Assad regime. You know, something that begins in a small city and then in effect catches fire and topples the regime and brings in ideally a new set of leaders who want to create either a constitutional monarchy or a genuinely democratic republic, which is what Iran has never had. So that's the ideal scenario. I would say it has a 25 to 30% chance of succeeding, but it really depends on factors we don't know yet. Like what the kind of the serendipity that happens when some courageous people rise up and there's a moment of opportunity and things go their way and then it spreads from there. I think the second best scenario is kind of like a Delcy Rodriguez Venezuela scenario in which members of the existing regime say, you know, we're going to get our asses kicked and we're going to lose everything unless we cut a deal that the United States, the Trump administration can live with. And that deal is verifiable, irreversible, permanent dismantling of all of their nuclear capabilities, including their insistence on enriching uranium or processing plutonium. The second thing is an end to their terrorist proxies. Why does a country as impoverished as Iran spend billions of dollars a year supporting the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas? Like, what is the logic of that? And finally, very serious curbs, if not the elimination of their ballistic missile programs, which are in their own way nearly as big a threat as their nuclear program. And if you get some kind of former regime figure like the former president Mohammad Khatami, who was considered kind of on the reformist side, and they agree to do this in a way that we can believe, that's a pretty damn good outcome too, even if it doesn't bring the freedom that I would like to see to the Iranian people. I do also think that there's a chance that the Iranians kind of wait us out. We politically lose patience with the effort. It ends after a month. And just because the Iranians didn't lose, even if they got their asses kicked, they can stand up and say, see, we stood up to the great Satan and we're still here. And that means that in 5 or 10 years, we're going to have to do this all over again because that sort of regime is going to inevitably try to reconstitute its forces.
Yeah, I think Trump was right when he said, look, worst case scenario, which is still a really good case scenario, is we have another, heinous leader, but yet we've taken out their ballistic and nuclear capabilities. I think it's even the worst case scenario is a good case scenario.
Some people say, gosh, there wasn't an imminent threat, so why are we doing this? That's like saying you go to your doctor and you get bad news, you have stage 1 cancer, in your prostate, right? Let's say, or if you're a woman in a breast. You don't just sort of sit there and say, hey, it's stage 1, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to take my sweet time until death is imminent, until stage 4. You deal with a stage 1 cancer as it is. So the worst case scenario is essentially we go from what we had, last year it was a stage 4 cancer because they were so close to a nuclear weapon. What happened in last June with the 12-day war brought it kind of down to stage 2. Now we're bringing it back to stage 1, if you'll accept this analogy. I know it's imperfect, Donnie, but if that's the case and we end up buying ourselves 10 more years of time, that's not a bad thing, because there are just forces within Iran, so much discontent within society, such complete economic collapse, that even buying yourself 5 years or 10 years time could give the Iranian public the opportunity, the moment to finally topple this regime from within.
I'm so concerned about the Democratic Party. It seems as if they are lurching further and further towards an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic point of view. Gavin Newsom, the leading candidate to be the next Democratic candidate, recently spoke, I think in the last day or two, and said that Israel is an apartheid state. We should no longer be supporting Israel. I'm curious your take on that and the overall kind of lurch in the Democratic Party towards an anti-Israel stance.
It's such a shame, because the Democratic Party was always the home not only of American Jews, but everyone who supported Israel. And the reasons for that aren't hard to see. Like, if you're gay, lesbian, you're LGBTQ, the only country in the Middle East you'd want to be in is Israel. Okay. In Palestine, gay people get tortured and thrown from buildings and dragged from the back of cars and beheaded. All right. That's what happens. That's the status of LGBTQ rights, both in the West Bank and in Hamas-controlled Gaza. If you're a woman, if you believe in women's rights, this is a country that has had a woman as prime minister, in the judiciary and so on. If you're a minority, people talk about Israel as an apartheid state. There are Arabs on the Israeli Supreme Court. There are Arabs in the Israeli parliament. I'm not saying the situation of Arabs in Israel is in any way ideal, and there's a lot of history there, and there's a lot of work that the Israelis have to do. But if you compare the status of Arabs in Israel versus, let's say, Jews in Tunisia, right, or anywhere else in the Middle East, it's night and day. And the point I'm making is, if you subscribe to traditional liberal values, Israel champions those values. What's happened with the Palestinians is an absolute tragedy, but it's a tragedy that came about because Israel's Arab neighbors launched a war, or were intending to launch a war of annihilation against Israel in 1967. Israel came into possession of territories it had not sought, right? And then returned many of those territories with a view towards eventually creating a Palestinian state. That's what the Oslo process was about in the 1990s. And in 2000, the year 2000, and again in the year 2008, Israeli prime ministers Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert made offers to the Palestinians to essentially create a state on what would have amounted to 97% of the West Bank and Gaza. You can quarrel over the percentages, but it was pretty damn close, right? And each time the Palestinians said no, and not only did they say no, but they moved in an increasingly radical direction. So Hamas is not interested in creating a Palestinian state side by side with Israel. Hamas is interested in creating a Palestine that replaces Israel. And why should it be surprising that Israelis say, hey, we don't want to be replaced. We don't want to be made exiles again. We don't want to go back to the disaster that we experienced for 2,000 years of dispossession. A point, I know I'm maybe talking too much, but let me make this point.
You're talking wonderfully.
I was giving a talk in Australia about a year and a half ago, and a young woman who looked to be college age stood up and basically said to me, what do you say to the fact that Israel is a settler colonialist state? I said, there was an audience of, 500 people. I said, how many people in this room, this is in Australia, how many people in this room have Aboriginal descent? Not one hand went up. I said, well, I hate to break this to you, but all of you are settler colonialists or the descendants and heirs and beneficiaries of settler colonialism. I said, don't feel bad. New Zealand is basically a settler colonialist state. Canada is a settler colonialist state. And my country, the United States, is a settler colonialist state. I can think of one country that has been fighting colonialism for 2,500 years. The Jews fought colonialism, and that was the story of the Babylonian captivity. By the way, we were freed as Jews from the Babylonian captivity by King Cyrus of Persia. And if Israel manages to help liberate the Iranian people. We will have repaid the favor after 2,500 years. They gave us our liberty. We can help give their liberty back to them. We were fighting colonialism against the Greeks. That's the story of Hanukkah. If anyone has heard of, Jewish Christmas, Hanukkah, that's the Jewish fight against Greek colonialism. We fought Roman colonialism. That was the situation at the time of Jesus. We fought Byzantine colonialism, Mamluk colonialism, Ottoman colonialism, and British colonialism. Zionism, under different names, but Zionism is the longest anti-colonial struggle in human history. So people who say they're against Israel, and by the way, they're also against settler colonialism, are contradicting themselves, but they're probably not sufficiently well educated to realize they're making that error.
Talk about another contradiction. You brought this up. It's so interesting that so many people are against the war, the same people that are for a two-state solution. And you talk about the irony of that actually the war is probably the best way to get us to a two-state solution.
Yeah, if this war goes as well as Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump hope, Bibi is going to be in a pickle, because all of a sudden the one country that was the head of the octopus of the so-called axis of resistance that had supported all of those terrorist anti-Israel militias on Israel's borders, if that country is no longer a threat, and Iraq is no longer a threat, and the Saudis come to the Israelis and say, hey, we'll make peace with you, but we expect real progress towards a viable Palestinian state, Bibi's not going to have an excuse to say no, because the Palestinians aren't going to have, Hamas isn't going to have Iran as its financier and its military backer. Israel's going to be surrounded by countries that don't pose an existential threat to it. And then Israelis are going to really have to have a reckoning with the fact that they should not permanently occupy other people. The purpose of Zionism is Jewish self-rule. It is not to be ruled by others, but it's also not to rule over others. And most Israelis hate the fact that they have to control the lives of so many Palestinians. I mean, there's a minority of Israelis who think that the West Bank is biblically given to the Jewish people, that they're never going to give it up. But the real argument against a second state, the strong argument that went over with many Israelis, was that from a security perspective, they couldn't afford it. It's too dangerous. Now you're going to have a scenario where that logic no longer applies. So if you're for a two-state solution, as I am, Donnie, right, then ending the Islamic Republic of Iran, I'm talking about the regime, not the country, is one of the ways in which you are going to make a Palestinian state so much more likely. And you're going to have the possibility of a Palestinian state that, instead of living as an armed camp trying to destroy Israel, is going to be a state that wants to cooperate with all of its neighbors. And by the way, not just Israelis, but Jordanians and Egyptians as well. You're creating a possibility for regional peace that we could hardly dream of, because there has been this cancer in the region, this deeply malign actor based in Tehran. So the opportunity here goes well beyond freedom for the Iranian people. It's a complete transformation for the regime.
Something that I don't think is getting enough attention, that to me trumps, no pun intended, everything else. I'm concerned about a really free and fair midterm election. I mean, Trump is already talking the way he does. He's very transparency. What are your thoughts as we head into the midterms?
Well, obviously, I'm worried about this talk about trying to nationalize elections. There's, people, I try to call balls and strikes as a commentator. And so when Trump does something I agree with, I'm not afraid to say so. But I think that in so many ways, and I have never voted for him in 3 successive elections, in so many ways he poses a real threat to not only the integrity of our elections and democratic institutions, but, if you will, kind of the software of the free world, the habits of a free mind. By constantly planting completely baseless, insane conspiracy theories in the minds of his voters, he is creating this kind of alternative reality, which millions of Americans are inclined to believe that somehow the government of the United States is illegitimate. It's really all about a deep state. And it has to be destroyed by a kind of a demagogic figure in his mold. It's interesting to me how the Epstein story played out and eventually boomeranged on so many people in the Trump figure. Of course, it's hitting everyone. But once you unleash conspiracy theories, right, there's no telling where it will go. And I'll add something more. Once you unleash conspiracy theories, you're eventually going to generate more anti-Semitism. And the reason for that is anti-Semitism is not just a bigotry. It's not just like, I don't like Jews, right? Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory about Jews. It's the ultimate conspiracy theory. Who really controls the media? The Jews. That's one anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Who's driving us into all of these wars? The Jews, and so forth and so on. So when you get a leader in the Oval Office who is propagating conspiracy theories about where Barack Obama was born or who won the 2020 elections, it's not actually at all shocking. And I can show you things I wrote years ago that predicted that this was going to land where it's landed.
Bret Stephens, I know how busy you are. I so appreciate your time. Keep up the great work. I'm so enjoy talking to you. I could do it all day long. I'm going to let you go, though, okay?
Thank you so much, Johnny. I really appreciate it.
Everybody, thanks for watching. If you like it, hit that subscribe button. And we love having you here watching On Brand. And just don't miss any future episodes. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.